Good morning, everybody here in Europe, and good afternoon, everybody in Indonesia. And welcome from Creative Culture, hosting this webinar, and our partners, the ICCO, to the 11th in our series of breakfast roundtables, which focus on exciting and growing markets, and today on Indonesia. So, thanks everybody for attending, and I'd like to introduce our experts, starting with Felipa Amata, who is Head of Research at the Centre for Indonesian Policy Studies. And as an experienced food and agriculture policy researcher, she'll be giving us an economic overview of the nation and focusing on the sustainability scope, a topic of huge importance currently affecting the sentiment and behaviour of locals. And after Felipa, she'll be followed by Ong Hock Chuan, who will be joining us as co-founder of Maverick. Maverick's one of the biggest independent PR consultancies in Jakarta. Ong will be sharing his media and communications experience with us and exploring the best communication channels to target and reach out to Indonesian consumers. When Ong is finished, Fahri Hutri, who is a communications research specialist at Love Frankie, will be joining us as a cultural expert with commercial product UX research background and extensive experience into the Indonesian market. Farah will share the peculiarities surrounding the Indonesian local consumer for companies to avoid the common mistake of oversimplifying Southeast Asia as one entity. Bringing her extensive customer insight experience, Dawn Herdman, director and founder of Illuminate Asia, which is a strategic insights consultancy focusing on Southeast Asia, with Indonesia at its heart of operations, will focus on how Indonesia differs from other Southeast Asian countries and give her perspective as an expat on any inaccurate preconceived notions that brands should be aware of when entering this market. And then finally, I'll be delighted to welcome Shatreen Siswayo, who is a marketing communications professional with extensive brand experience, having worked across APAC and the Indonesian market for multiple global brands, including Uber, Twitter, Philips, and ByteDance. And she'll share key consumer trends and nuances around international brands that they need to be aware of to be successful in this market. Thank you to all our panelists, and we'll, first of all, I'd like to introduce Felipa to talk to for a few minutes about her area of expertise. Felipa.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thanks, Melanie, and thanks everyone for this opportunity to join this very exciting discussion. To begin with, allow me to paint a broad picture on the Indonesian market that hopefully can serve as backdrop for our discussion today as we explore the market. But I want to particularly highlight some of the demographic trends, economy trends, and also the policy trends recently. So as some of us may know, Indonesia has the 4th largest population in the world with 270 million people, and that is projected to increase by 12 million people more in the next 5 years, spread across the thousands of islands. 56% of these live in urban areas, while the rest live in rural areas. And we also have a particularly growing middle income group that is growing faster than any other groups, expanding at about 10% per year, now making up 20% of the population, or at 52 million people, mostly residing in urban areas. Indonesia is also enjoying a demographic dividend with 67% of the population currently in the productive age. But also we still have poverty, which is now at around 9%, and that is predicted to increase significantly during and after the pandemic. So this interesting demographic landscape carries unique implications for consumer preference, characteristics, and trends that may differ depending on their age, their race and ethnicity, or their locations, and just a whole host of other factors, which will definitely be explored further by other panelists as they unpack all of these intricacies. So companies really should consider these factors when they're thinking about their customer segmentation in Indonesia. In terms of the economy, the growing middle class and their consumption has been a main driver of Indonesia's strong economic growth. Indonesia's economic growth has been slowing down, but is still relatively steady at around 5% annually. So as our gross national income per capita is now at $4,100, Indonesia is now considered an upper middle income country by the World Bank. The economy is dominated by manufacturing and processing industry, followed by agriculture, forestry and fisheries, wholesale and retail trade, construction, and also mining. But more recently, Indonesia's digital economy is also thriving, especially in e-commerce and also financial technology. It's now even considered as the largest in Southeast Asia. So really, there's a huge opportunity for companies to set up shop in Indonesia. And now in terms of policy, to continue this economic growth, the Indonesian government recently passed a significant policy reform through Omnibus Law on Job Creation. In one sweep, this law revises or even removes provisions across 79 previous laws that were thought to be a barrier on investment. So this is considered necessary as Indonesia's ranking in the Ease of Doing Business Index have been stuck at 73rd out of 190 countries, and the Starting a Business Index is even lower at 140th. So the Omnibus Law is meant to address this by improving investment and business landscape, and particularly through relaxing many provisions on labor, environment, land procurement, business licensing, as well as investment limitations. It also addresses potential discrepancies in local regulations that often contradict or pose additional barriers to businesses and investments through efforts to harmonize the regulations across just the diverse levels of government within Indonesia. However, some of the reforms are in conflict with the population's preference. For example, this is where I want to highlight the sustainability issue. So the Indonesian population, mostly young and middle class, as I mentioned, are increasingly concerned with sustainability as a core issue. Yet the central government revises regulations and systems around environmental impact assessment or environmental management. So this was of course met with public outcry, and has been leading to interesting discussion in 2020 that indicates there's a tension between what the population sees as important versus what the government prioritizes. So companies can carefully consider these tensions when they're planning their public relations or government affairs in Indonesia. For example, there's a case where 32 global investors then wrote an open letter taking the stand and raising their concerns on sustainability risks in Omnibus Law. So in sum, there's a huge opportunity to set up business and engage in Indonesian market. But of course, there's a complex differences between the different race, ethnicities, locations, and demographic characteristics. So hopefully this has given a general background of the Indonesian market that we can use and keep in mind as we explore the trends, opportunities, and challenges later during the discussion. So thank you so much again for the time, and I look forward to the discussion later.
Thank you very much, Philippa. That's very interesting. To follow that on, would you like to speak to us?
I think Philippa has given you a very good overview of Indonesia. Just to put a bit more perspective on that, if you look at Indonesia's 17,000 islands and you put them on a map of the USA, it's actually longer than the USA. You know, starting in California, it goes beyond New York. That's how big and how spread out Indonesia is. Also coupled to that is that, you know, in terms of ethnicities, there are 600 over ethnic groups and 700 languages. So it's a very big, complex market. I show you this slide. It's from Hootsuite that compiles social media usage. So it's all very interesting because if you look at the mobile phone connections, it is actually 124% of the population. So you have a lot of people with 2 mobile phones, 3 mobile phones walking around, quite heavy on their pockets. But this is how connected and plugged in Indonesia is. Of the 272 million, 175 million actually use the internet. So the internet penetrates in spite of the infrastructure challenges. The internet usage is huge. 64% of the population, that's 175 million. And active social media users is 160 million, so 59% of the population. So Indonesia is one of the largest markets for a lot of the internet platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Now, this is also quite interesting. Indonesians, on the average, spend about 7 hours, nearly 8 hours using the internet, of which 3.5 hours is spent using social media. They say that it's 3 hours on television, 1 hour listening to music, and 1 hour, 23 minutes on gaming. So gaming is also very big in huge sectors with Indonesia. These are the major platforms. YouTube is now the most watched platform, and you know the major stars in YouTube have something like 26 million subscribers. Following that, what is actually very powerful, it's sometimes considered social media, other times people think of it as just a chat platform, but that's where all the rumors start, that's where a lot of crisis issues and information gets around, is WhatsApp. Almost any Indonesian that you talk to is on WhatsApp. So WhatsApp is huge. Facebook is also huge, but it's perceived as something for the older generation. The younger generation are going into Instagram. Twitter has seen actually a bit of a decrease because many people regard it as quite toxic, and it's a battleground for a lot of politicians. An interesting thing is that the person with the most number of followers in Indonesia is Jokowi, who's the president. He's got something like 15 million followers. The next highest number of followers is his political opponent, Prabowo Subianto. So they had this election earlier in the year. Jokowi won, Prabowo lost the presidency. So what Jokowi did was co-opted him and made him the defense minister, a bit like Biden making Trump the defense minister. But that's Indonesia for you. And then finally, one more slide. In terms of, someone had a question sent over, what's the media scene like? In terms of print, Jawa Post, which is a group of publications and newspapers, is the biggest, followed by Kompas, which is most highly regarded. But if you look at these figures, Indonesia is not a huge reading nation. The largest newspapers have only about 500,000 in a country of 270 million people. Added to that also is that the newspapers are having a hard time, like newspapers everywhere. So a lot of them have been downsizing, circulation's been going down, advertising certainly has gone down, and so a lot of them are struggling. So a lot of them move online. Online, you have a lot of views. Detik.com, which is the biggest news portal, has got about 12 million hits a day, followed by Kompas and Tribune News. So a lot of the consumption is online, and you tie that with the figures about, you know, being on mobile, being on internet, everything is moving towards digital. TV stations are the largest ones in Indonesia. So what we are seeing, what all this means is that everything is moving into digital. My company, Maverick, we just did a news consumption survey, and we will be unveiling that on December 15th. But very interesting things is that the Gen Y and Gen Z, they don't read newspapers. They consume whatever's online, but India, what we would call their information ecosystems. So if you're in their Facebook feeds, their Instagram feeds, their TikTok feeds, you get the information through. If you're not in that ecosystem, the information, the message does not get through. So that is very important note, because they don't rely on the traditional mass media for information anymore. So this is what's happening. Being digital also creates problems. And as I said earlier before, Twitter has become a political battleground. It's also been used by many companies to discredit other companies. One of my clients, for instance, we got wind that opposition brand was trying to take advantage of the French boycott because of Macron's statements about Islam. And there was a call for what we call buzzers, which are basically hired guns on the internet. They wanted several of them to start a hashtag about the company. True enough, at the appointed hour, from 0 hashtags on that particular hashtag, it jumped to about 7,000 on Twitter and other social media as well. So you see lots of games like that are being played. And as someone in PR, we keep telling our clients that one has to be very careful. There's a lot of noise on the internet, but you have to separate the signal from the noise. And that usually trips a lot of people up because they confuse the noise for the signal. So these are exciting times, and I think where communications in Indonesia is concerned, very edgy stuff, and there's a lot that you can do and a lot that you can try.
Thank you, Ong. That's really interesting. Now I'd like to ask Farah to tell us a little bit about her area of expertise.
Thanks, Paul. I'm thrilled to be here, and what an excellent views from Felipa and Paong. I've myself learned a lot from your sessions. So a little bit background about myself. Before I joined Love Frankie, I've had my fun time working with companies and brands for more commercial purposes, mainly in consumer goods, health, and tech sectors. When I work with clients and brands, so no matter the sector they operate in, no matter the stage of the product maturity or whether it's local or global brands, I'm always advocating for the importance of incorporating cultural and societal context in the business problem they try to crack. Why? Because there is always an opportunity to enhance the effectiveness of business or your marketing plan through improved understanding of consumers on a local basis. So one of my favorite framework to understand culture is Hofstede's 6 cultural dimension theory, which can be used to understand the impact in a business setting, although public sectors can also benefit from this. Several benefits in incorporating cultural view is that recognizing the culture means knowing the tone of voice for your consumers' communications and also anticipating changing needs in the era of rapidly changing world. So what does Hofstede says about Indonesia cultural? So it says that Indonesia has a high score for power distance. This means that the Indonesian society tends to depend on hierarchy. The second is that Indonesia is considered as feminine country, meaning it's less masculine than other Asian countries like Japan or China. Feminine culture means that the dominant value in the society is paying attention to others and your quality of life and less about competing with others. So the previous example by Paong about making the Donald Trump the defense ministry, it's the kind of harmony you will see a lot in Indonesia. Indonesians also tend to avoid uncertainty, meaning in the middle of conflict, Indonesians are more concerned with maintaining relationships and harmony, meaning diplomacy before the truth. In terms of long-term orientations, Indonesians shows an ability to adapt traditions easily to change conditions and perseverance in achieving results. Lots of tear-jerking ads in Indonesia. Recognize this to create emotionally effective ads. The 5th dimension is about restraint versus indulgence. Indonesia has a culture of restraint, meaning perception that their actions are restrained by social norms. They feel that indulging themselves is somewhat wrong based on cultural or religion morals. However, this is slowly shifting too. So conversations around indulgence and self-care, more about physical care and self-love, accepting you for what you are is now more common than ever. So the last one, I think everybody knows this. Indonesia has high score for collectivism. To Indonesian, the time spent together, focusing on community or family, caring for each other, represents a balanced lifestyle. Indonesians are actually more social than the maker of social media platform. However, as Felipa has mentioned in her introductions, Indonesia's modern history has a pretty colorful turbulency, and not all these cultural dimensions I mentioned before remain static. Back to you, Paul. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Farah. Now I'd like to move to Dawn Herdman, who can give her views on her perspective as an expat, and also on how Indonesia may differ from other Southeast Asian nations.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, everyone. I feel very privileged to be here as part of this roundtable discussion this afternoon. As I think the introductions outlined, I am working as part of Illuminate Asia, which is strategic insights consultancy. So we're doing consumer insights, qualitative and quantitative research. We're also spending a lot of time looking into cultural insights, and as Farah said, it's about understanding how the culture is incorporated into consumer behavior as well. We were founded in Indonesia around almost a decade ago, but as the introducer mentioned, we're working across Southeast Asia, particularly in Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, Vietnam. So in my introduction here, I would like to just give a little bit of background on a couple of areas. First is about my perspective as an expat. I've been based in Indonesia for more than 10 years, but having been based in Southeast Asia for several years before that in Thailand and working in the region for many, many years. So I guess my perspective as an expat and as a foreigner in the country was when I relocated there in 2009, it wasn't completely foreign to me. I was already quite used to it. But I think the really interesting thing about Indonesia, and I think some of the speakers have already mentioned on this, is to really understand such an interesting market. Now, it is a very diverse market, geographically, ethnically, religiously, culturally. There's more than 300 languages being spoken in Indonesia in itself. So what we find is different parts of Indonesia are very different in their perspective and how they consume products and services and how they interact with each other. So that in itself is very interesting. And for somebody like myself who's into culture, into consumer behavior, obviously Indonesia was a real draw card. As an expat, on a personal note, I've always found Indonesians to be very warm, very friendly, very welcoming to foreigners, and on a personal note, and also in terms of doing business in the country as well. Indonesians are very sociable people. I think Farah mentioned about the collectivism. And I think one thing to note as an expat perspective is I think it's even more important to really to get to know the people we're working with on a professional and a personal level. And of course, always important to be, authentic and transparent. And I think when we look at Indonesian consumers, I think first and foremost, it is not one hat fits all Indonesian consumers. And it's definitely not one hat fits all Southeast Asians. The cultures in the countries are very, very different, of course. I mean, even if you look at a basis of religion in the different countries, I mean, it's so diverse and so different across markets. I think with Indonesia being such a vast country, I think it's very important as a market researcher, as an insights person, to really ensure that we consider all the differences across the country, and then also obviously put that into play against comparisons against the other markets nearby. So one thing that I've seen over the years doing multi-country studies, multi-country work in the region, is that sometimes there is a tendency for clients or for colleagues to kind of lump the region together. So for example, coming from Europe or America, launching a communications campaign for a product or launching a new product and trying to kind of fit it into all of the markets in Southeast Asia. I guess, my perspective is it's a very difficult thing to do because the way that the markets will react to one campaign or one product is going to be very different, for Indonesia. But one thing I would like to note is that some of the multinational companies who've done very, very well in Indonesia are those that are able to really localize. So they're able to look at the market, look at what Indonesian consumers need, how that might be different to other markets, tweak the product, and definitely tweaking the communications to make sure that it's fitting with the cultural nuances and the country nuances.
Thanks very much, Dawn. And finally, I'd like to welcome Shatrin to talk to us for a few minutes.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. Selamat sore. My name is Catherine, with background include journalism, marketing, and communication across the US and also Asia Pacific. I'm here actually to share more about these consumer trends and then how it has impacted brand and then what brands usually seek for, and for hopefully giving some insights on how to navigate Indonesian market. First come first, Indonesia, I think one thing that sometimes people forget, and having worked with a lot of, well, not a lot, but having worked with multinational companies or even kind of like local companies as well, sometimes, when we look into Indonesia, people only focusing in Jakarta. Now, news break, Indonesia is not Jakarta, right? So it's, there are many different cities across Indonesia. So this means in terms of communications, in terms of the trends, in terms of what people like, even a city that is only 2 hours away from Jakarta is sometimes different than Jakarta itself. So one thing that I've always said to even, where I currently work, to always remember this aspect, not to see it from people in Jakarta point of view, but also see it from, for instance, people from Medan or people from Makassar, people from Balikpapan, for instance, to make sure that you capture what really means for them, especially if you're talking about communicating as a brand. Secondly, I have some insight as well from McKinsey and company. They've recently actually done series of COVID-19 consumer pulse survey. And then between September 21st to 30th, actually, one thing that I notice about Indonesians, I mean, me, myself as an Indonesian, is, we are quite an optimistic people. In terms of compared to the rest of the Southeast Asia, for instance, respondents on this survey actually confident that the economy will rebound within 2 to 3 months and grow just as strong or stronger than before COVID-19. And this is actually 53% of them believe in that. Secondly, as well, this is not only just McKinsey who say that, but PwC Consumer Insight Survey also mentioned that 64% of Indonesian consumers are pretty much optimistic about the future and will spend more of their household income. So this actually means as well on how we as a brand navigate this pandemic COVID-19 as well. In terms of the sensitivity, in terms of the tonality, every brand right now is learning on how to manage this. But it's actually quite good to see that our people are actually quite optimistic about this. I think Dawn and the other panelists already mentioned that community, parents, families are everything. So these are kind of like the community that we always rely on to. That's why if you see a lot of brands or companies actually try to appeal more into this sort of notion of community, parents and families as their core of communication or messaging. One thing as well that is currently on the rise is actually mental health awareness. So what I noticed as well, from the brand point of view and also from the chatter on the social media, more and more Indonesians actually realize the importance of self-care. And I think this also kind of like, if you see a lot of startups and psychologists, for instance, start to have or share more insight and tips on social media, to talk more about mental health awareness. And then in terms of the trends itself, this is still coming from McKinsey. So Indonesians, during this period of pandemic, Indonesians have acquired at-home alternatives to out-of-home activities, such as remote learning. I'm not just talking about parents who are accompanying their kids doing online studying or whatnot, but more and more Indonesians adults actually participate in some kind of like online learning. It could be, like a class, or it could be, for instance, on TikTok, there is a hashtag called Sama-Sama Belajar. And it has been viewed, if I'm not mistaken, over 30 billion. This is actually a hashtag where people can share life hacks, tips, how to speak Mandarin, how to speak French. So anything that involves around education or sharing skills and knowledge type of thing. And then obviously more people doing online streaming, and then online games is also on the rise. So there's also an increase as well of people actually using the new type of media. I would also say that there has been a kind of like a big shift towards supporting the local brands. I'm not talking about kind of like a big brands only, but also kind of like small, medium businesses. As you know, during this pandemic, a lot of people probably have lost their jobs or probably, have more time at home. So a lot of Indonesians actually have started joining online businesses. And what I find it quite interesting is a lot of them are actually supporting each other. For instance, if my friends selling mac and cheese. It's a homemade or whatnot. You know, me as a friend, I will do like a free advertisement kind of thing to kind of like promote their brand or their businesses. So it's quite interesting as well to see that the community, how people support each other on that, will also translate online as well. And then another thing is light-hearted content actually sells. Now, Indonesians love comedy. That's loves to laugh, right? Like that's just kind of like one of the things as well, that brands that sell comedy usually, or you know, like the way they communicate are kind of like light-hearted or receh ya. We call it Indonesia receh. It actually gets the most engagement. It's because it's relatable, right? And I think in the daily life, you have to go through like a lot of heavy work, or, you know, there's like problem here and there. And, you know, when you go online, or if you want to engage with your brands, you want something that's lighthearted, that doesn't make you think too much, pretty much. So one of the things as well is not just the brands, but also the influencers as well. So influencers like Edozel, or even, you know, like the funny people, Bude Sumiati, right? She's a woman on Twitter. She's very sarcastic, and she's just so funny, and it just relates to us, right? It's just silly and lighthearted and, you know, receh, and sometimes that's all we need, right? And I find that more and more brands engaging this type of tonality and influencers and the way they communicate, because I think you need to be relevant to this audience that you're speaking to. And then K-pop, K-drama, K-wave, that's pretty much on the rise. I mean, if you're BTS ARMY, if you are Blackpink lovers, this is kind of like the place, because right now, you know, this is on the rise. And as you see as well, the brands in Indonesia, e-commerce brands, for instance, actually start embracing these K-pop idols to promote their brands to the audiences. I think one more thing is more Indonesian artists actually go global right now. Coming from TikTok, we've seen like a lot of songs coming from Indonesia being used abroad. I give you an example of Melly Guslo, a song that was popular 10 years ago. And then suddenly this year it went mad, and even Jennifer Lopez used that song. I think if maybe like 2 to 3 years ago, for an artist to go international, you know, you need to go so many different things to go to that level. But now, thanks to the technology, it actually works. Even as you know, We're Geniuses with Lati, right? That goes like awesome. Like it goes all the way to the US, the popularity. Even we have reached not just We're Genius, we have Rich Brian, we have Stephanie as well. So it's kind of like more and more local talents go international. That's kind of like the national pride, the local pride. I think that's something as well that more and more brands start to notice and then start to engage and tap on that.
Thank you, Shetrin. That was excellent, very interesting. I just like, on behalf of everybody, thank the panelists. I think that's absolutely excellent and a very, very good thumbnail portrait of the Indonesian market. And that spurred quite a lot of questions we've got, by the way. I'll kick off with one from Erica Bianco. Because of all the languages that have been mentioned that are spoken in Indonesia, what language would you recommend to use when marketing to the country? And I think there was a follow-up question from Julian Boulding as well, which is what percentage of the population speak English, and what is the best language for global brands to use?
Bahasa Indonesia or Indonesian is the national language that is being used, and it's understood by almost everybody in Indonesia. That's being used in advertisements as well. Now, as the percentage of English, I would say probably less than 20%. See, as Shetrin said, Indonesia is not Jakarta. So if you're in Jakarta, you could get away with speaking English to most people. They would understand it. But once you get out into the villages, into, you know, the provinces, very, very few people speak English.
I've got a question here. This is about TikTok, which is obviously a well-known and trendy platform in Indonesia. How will PR agencies in specifics respond to this? And how do you integrate PR activities and build content on TikTok?
I think before we jump into how a brand can actually jump into TikTok, I think we need to understand first on why TikTok actually on the rise right now and why Indonesia feels relevance towards TikTok. So I could say a few reasons. One is the originality. The rise of social media, this also means like, rise of different personalities, right, on the social media platforms. And sometimes these personalities embed perfections. Other platforms, social media platforms, for instance, actually encourage people to be perfect. Not just people. If you take photo of your food, everything needs to be perfect, right? So I think a lot of us actually a bit tired of that, right? Because in the reality, nothing is perfect. And I think that's one of the things that, actually sells for TikTok in Indonesia is the originality that people seek from a platform. But people find TikTok entertaining in this day and age where everything else, if you read the news or whatever, you got frustrated and you got depressed. TikTok actually offers you happiness and joy and inspiration, and also the creativity as well. So way back when there is only one video platform, only certain people with resources, for instance, can actually create videos or create content. That kind of like limits many people who wants to be content creators, for instance. That kind of like this three thing answering the next question, which is how brand jumps into this. So if you see actually many brands, one of the things that they're looking for is community and engagement. TikTok communities are actually quite strong, given that a lot of people, the very original themselves, it's actually make people trust each other more rather than, you paint this perfect picture or whatever. So the community that's trusting each other is actually, one of the things that why brand usually trying to engage them. In terms of the secondly is the creativity. So one of the cool thing about brand, usually they go on TikTok and they let the TikTok communities or creators to interpret their brands. Meaning that if you go on TikTok, do not expect that your brand will be only one-way communication. Anyone on TikTok can actually interpret your brand. Recently, there is a Jakarta fashion show, for instance. That was a live show on TikTok. Even high-end brand like Balenciaga, Gucci, they actually start jumping on TikTok because they want to democratize the brand.
Just to move on to another question we just had, and this one was directed for Philippa, and this is from Franz Adiamata. And he says, do you have any insight or data related to consumer perceptions of environmentally friendly products or companies that care to do sustainability? So will consumers, for example, buy more environmentally friendly products produced by companies that care about sustainability?
I don't have specific data on sales number on sustainability products, but I wanted to note that, of course, there are price considerations first and foremost that often trump sustainability considerations, as a lot of Indonesians are still in poverty or mostly vulnerable to poverty, so they cannot really afford environmentally friendly products that tend to be more expensive, for example. But for the middle class, for the urban middle class, sustainability is definitely a consideration, and many of them consciously opt to buy more environmentally friendly products. For example, we've had a research on the food and beverage industry, and we found that in a food delivery service, the number of merchants that chose to provide green options have increased by 17 times. So they changed their plastics, they changed their packaging, etc. So companies are responding to this. And this is also in response to the consumer preference, as the same food delivery service reported that 97% of the consumers chose not to use single-use cutlery or plastics when they're given the option. So a lot of the middle-class urban population chose the environmentally options. And we're seeing this in a lot of companies and restaurants that have also introduced recyclable packaging or recyclable plastic bags.
Great. I just want to move on, and we had another question just sent in, this one for Farah, actually. What is the addressable market in Indonesia, especially for a global brand? Are they mostly urban, or are there opportunities to target people living in less populated rural areas?
So statistically, 1 in 5 Indonesians are middle class, and they're more willing to spend the money. Half of the population that lives in urban. So it's understandable that most brands and companies targeting operation in key cities in Indonesia, so Jakarta, Surabaya, Medan, Balikpapan, Malang. Yes, they're mostly in Java, although with the future plan, there is a future plan from the government to move capital city from Java to Kalimantan. So Kalimantan is another big island in Indonesia, known as the Sleeping Giant. It's an island with huge economic potential, driven mainly by mining. not really sustainable from Philippa perspective. Yeah. So, I mean, in my point of view, opportunities can always be created, right? But is it financially rewarding for the new brands to directly targeting less populated islands or rural? No matter how good your product is, but if your consumers can get hold of it, that will be a pity. Even if you are an old brand with decades of experience, you'll know how important it is to secure a solid distribution channel and reliable supply chain. With fast digital adoption and rising purchase through e-commerce, even big brands like L'Oreal, Unilever, Reckitt Becancer, the old players, struggle to fulfill the demand. One thing I noticed is the emergence of enabler commerce. So companies like Circlo, Jet Commerce from China, they're offering service as a solution provider in facilitating these companies to sell online and expand their businesses. So they're providing and managing the whole system from CRM, stocking, distribution fleet, marketing tactics, marketing plan, etc. I think it's more of pondering questions than direct questions.
Just to add to Farah, I think the challenge in Indonesia in the past has always been on logistics, right? You got 17,000 islands. A lot of the infrastructure is not built properly. So it's always a challenge. And therefore, some local brands, some foreign brands that bought into local brands, they tended to dominate the market because they control the infrastructure. But now, as Farah said, you have logistics companies coming in. Internet's also changing how things are being bought, sold, distributed. So what you're seeing is a certain democratization of that and a loosening of the control by a few companies. In terms of prospects, huge.
Yeah, if I can just jump in as well and just mention that, yeah, I think traditionally Indonesian consumers were relying heavily on the general trades at the local market or the small mom and pop shops, which really relied on the distribution network. So exactly what the other panelists have said there. But I think, yeah, absolutely now with more e-commerce and more shopping online, I think it's very much opened up opportunities for other players.
Actually, Dawn, we had a question that you might like to lead on, in fact. Do you have any insights to share about the personal care and skincare market in the country?
I think some of the trends recently that Indonesians panelists here would be aware of is that number one is the Korean trend. So obviously in terms of K-pop and generally speaking, it's been extremely strong. But when it comes to skincare, it's also now being seen as one of the ideal kind of skin typologies to be aspiring towards. And I think another shift that we've seen, which can be in line with this, is a switching from whitening. I think traditionally this idea of wanting to have a whiter or fairer skin was something that was a really, really, really big factor. But I think what we see now is emerging is more about glowing or bright rather than changing or desiring to actually change a skin tone as such. It's more about enhancing what the natural skin tone would be. I want to touch on another really big one is the area of men's personal care and skincare. I think that is also a sector that is expanding and growing. I think there's a lot, even in the last few years, many more brands are emerging, and this is an area that guys who I think, again, traditionally Indonesian males have been a little bit not into this, but becoming more and more kind of metrosexual and looking after themselves and caring for personal care and skin. So that's another very large area that's continuing to grow.
I agree that definitely there's a shifting from wanting to be more white into, I saw this in TikTok actually, and I think it's quite inspiring. It says that normalize using the foundation with the same color as yours. So if you are more a bronze skin tone, use the same foundation as colors of yours. Don't aim to, make it look whiter or look brighter. Just embrace yourself. What I found interesting is that women in Indonesia, since their childhood, is expected to take care of their appearance. I mean, to be in a certain size, to be in the right skin tones. But the implication of this shifting is that a more local brands are trying to celebrate the uniqueness in you. My favorite example is a cosmetic local brand, BLP by Lizzie Para. So they're recently launching 12 shades of foundations. So, people can choose whatever skin tones they are most suitable and use it. So yeah, I think it's quite inspirational.
If I can just jump in one more here as well, is also the trend of some of the Islamic brands, Islamic focus, or particularly for Muslim women. And one brand in particular is Wada, which has done really, really well in the last few years, targeting not only Muslim women or Islamic women, but being a brand that's a very aspirational brand for all women, but also with that particular Islamic focus, it's also been very successful.
Yep. So halal is no longer a requirement for Muslim consumers, but it signifies a quality of assurance. So I think Wardah has become more inclusive. In the past, their communications using a woman in hijab like me, but now, I mean, they're using the women of all shapes, sizes, and looks. So I think it's very interesting.
Just I wanted to ask a question. Maybe Felipe, you could start this one. What do you think the economic outlook post-COVID is going to be, and how do you think this is going to affect market behavior?
Thanks, Paul. It's interesting that earlier, I think Farah mentioned that Indonesians tend to be very optimistic. But unfortunately, the reality is that economic outlook might take a little bit longer than the population expected. We are officially in recession as with other countries in the world, but we are starting to see a very slow rebound as Indonesia has opened up all sorts of mobility restrictions and allowing the economy to start again. But still, we are expecting that the economic downturn is likely to be worse than previously expected as it struggles to manage the pandemic. Even until now, we're still seeing rising number of cases. So this will definitely impact how Indonesia can recover in its economy. And then in terms of how this will implicate market update and behavior, I think the panelists have alluded to several interesting trends that are likely to continue afterwards. The first being shift to digital economy. So I think the economic growth will largely be facilitated by digital economy. A lot of the small businesses that open up in e-commerce, for example, or just any other types of businesses that are now moving towards having digital access. And then the second one is that I think the consumption trend will be different. For the secure middle class, we are still seeing that consumption is relatively unchanged, but for those that are vulnerable or in poverty, of course, we're seeing that because they've experienced drastic reduction in income, that also influenced their consumption. So a lot of people are consuming less, they're buying less, they're eating out less, and they're really trying to save more. That's like a cycle that also slows down the economic recovery post-COVID-19.
Right. We had a question from Mark Winkle, and it's around social media. Given the predominance and scale of social media use in Indonesia, which campaigns or strategies may have had any global ripples, and why does communications strategy or planning often seem to be sent in from abroad, outside Indonesia? And shouldn't Indonesia's comms experts be able to export brands and comms experience elsewhere?
As you would know, most of the people that employ agencies and consultancies here, even if they're international companies from outside wanting to do business in Indonesia, they want to reach the market here. So a lot of communications, a lot of social media, etc., is geared towards this market, not necessarily to a market outside. So until we see the day whereby a lot of Indonesian products are being sold overseas, I don't think we'll see that, much of that. As to why, like a lot of strategies, campaigns imported from outside, I think it depends. Again, you know, you might have international companies, and depending on their culture, some of them are very top down and this is what will dictate. So if that happens, then the local guys are forced to go with it. But then you have other companies that says, okay, well, that's what works elsewhere. But in Indonesia, We just have to make it different. And that's where you start to adapt. This thing about international and local is interesting, because a lot of times what works internationally, what's acceptable or even desirable internationally is a no-no in Indonesia. So for instance, if you talk about inclusivity, LGBTQ rights, you embrace this in the West, it's hailed as great stuff, inclusivity, etc. You do this openly in Indonesia, you would have people protesting against you. It's very hard to carry on business. Again, this whole complexities of internationalization and being aware of the local culture and sensitivities.
You know, from what I find as well, working with brands in-house, I think more and more brands embrace and empowers local team. And I find that quite refreshing in a way that if and when, say, global, for instance, has certain type of a campaign or whatnot, usually the kind of like, you know, brands that do top and bottom, now it's a bit rare. A lot of them actually just, you know, ask the local team, do you think it's going to work or not? And if it does, do you want to localize it? And I think many of the brands here actually have embraced that, the sense that, you know, you actually take the ownership of the campaign. So if you find like many of the campaign that many brands, even international brands launch, might be differ from one country to another. I think with this day and age, more brands actually select the empowering local team and then wanting to localize and see what works locally.
I just want to expand on this. There was a question around the general perceptions on diversity and inclusion in Indonesia and the way local and global brands position themselves. Has there been any recent changes following the responses in the US and Europe over the spring and summer?
First, you have to understand if certain ideas about inclusion is already localized or not. For example, feminism. So in our line of work, we are trying to understand what feminism means for people in Indonesia. Because this topic is very sensitive, what we did was an online social listening to know what people think of feminism. So the findings were quite interesting. Those who against the feminism agenda said that, this is a Western agenda, trying to eradicate religion from Indonesia. There isn't even a mocking narration about feminism called feminazi, and feminism born in the West as the answer to West woman problem. There is a gap in narration about religion and feminists can actually go hand in hand. They shouldn't be, you know, fighting each other, because there is actually a religion values that supports feminism value. And another second important thing is that you don't want to talk in echo chamber, meaning it's very important to understanding the issue from the perspective of the regular people. You know, sometimes the development issues are discussed only in the sphere of academicians, researchers and all. But what I admit is that it is very lacking understanding from the normal people. So addressing your communication, addressing your tone of voice is important. A recent example I found, I attended the TED Jakarta last week. So there's this brand, it's Body Shop. Of course, it's an international brand. Body Shop steps up campaign in support for sexual violence bills. They came from the understanding that 93% of sexual violence in Indonesia never reported, and only 1% case is solved. So they're working together with local CSOs, Pulih Foundation, and Magdalene, an online media with gender perspective. What they do is gaining online petition in the shops and offline, even organize silent protests. I think this is brave, and I think it's important for younger generation when selecting a brand, they know what does the brand stand for. And lastly, we cannot work alone in inclusion and diversity matter. We need cooperation from public and private sectors.
Dawn, I just had a question for you. From your perspective as an expat, how do you find the Indonesian market different from neighboring countries such as Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines?
I can give you some examples from, for example, for a country like Thailand, culturally very different. Thais, somewhat more individualistic. somewhat more sophisticated in things like skincare and personal care regimes, and a lot more body conscious perhaps. If you're talking, and we were talking before about personal care as one example, and we've done work across those markets in personal care, what works in Thailand is really, really going to be fundamentally different than what might work in Indonesia. And I think we touched on this in terms of, for example, you know, that the skin brightening, or the idea of inclusivity of Muslim or halal as well. Those sorts of areas are very important in Indonesia. It would be less so in a country like Thailand. Even of a country like Philippines, obviously fundamentally very, very different, has a very different context and background and history in terms of the religion and the colonialism as well. So they have a lot more Americanisms, a different way of looking at it, and even the brands in each of the markets. So we work for one quite famous baby skincare brand, and it's very, very strong in a country like Philippines. It's like iconic, whereas in Indonesia, it would be something that has a different context and a different background. So you simply can't import one thing from one market into another. And I think even a country like Malaysia, which I guess people would think would be more similar, because a Malay people is more similar linguistically and culturally to Indonesians. But actually it is very different. I can see Ong is shaking his head, but I think, again, it's extremely different. I think that some of the things that we see is that, the cultural mix of Malaysia having key ethnic groups of Chinese and Indian and Malay, that mix and that dynamic makes a massive difference, as does kind of the cultural heritage and background of the British colonialism as well. And again, it's not simply a matter of just importing from Malaysia into Indonesia or vice versa.
Just to jump in on what Dawn has said, I think one of the things about Indonesia is that it is a very complex society. The old approach of segmentation, because that's what we all do, works to a certain degree. But then now with social media democratizing things, a whole new dynamic comes in. Companies that wish to market to Indonesia should constantly ask themselves, how can I be useful to my market, my audience, be relevant to them? Online, if you're not relevant, you're not useful, you're nothing. The great thing about social media is it allows you to talk to a lot of different audiences using a lot of different channels, as it were. You have to embrace that kind of complexity if you want to play in Indonesia.
We're getting very close to time now, everybody, because it's been sort of so interesting. And we ask everybody to give one do and one don't about working within and around the Indonesian market.
I think one of the big don'ts, for my perspective, don't just come into Indonesia and tap into the market as if it's expansion of the market, but do take the time to actually engage with local communities, for example, through partnerships, for example, through your corporate social responsibility, through your communications. Take the time to get to know the different cultures in the different islands, the urban versus the rural population, and establish yourself as a brand that actually cares about Indonesia and wants to adapt to the Indonesian context, and adopting your brand as one with Indonesian context, not just an international brand coming in.
One don't is do not assume that we all think and act like Jakartans, because Indonesia is quite large and diverse in that sense. Do think how brand can actually contribute to the country. I think that actually will help brands to appear more genuine, to be more accepted in the community.
If you want to do business in Indonesia, do your due diligence. Double check, triple check, quadruple check, especially the people you're doing business with. There are a lot of great Indonesians, but there are a lot of tricky ones as well. Corruption is endemic in this country. There are so many clients that come to us for crisis communications, and it's kind of like, what possessed you to lend money to this group that has a reputation of not paying it back? Do your due diligence and don't take Indonesia for granted as one entity. It is many entities. Indonesia is not Jakarta or the big cities. Most of the population is out there, and they are in a vastly different world from Jakarta. So if you want to market successfully, you've got to keep your eye on that ball rather than just Jakarta.
I'm going to frame my answer in the context of digital marketing effort. I think we all really need a reality check. People primarily want to connect with each other online, not brands. I mean, it's a common instinct for brands trying to be the solver, the hero that saves the day. However, Indonesian consumers nowadays expect the brands to be the partner and the enabler. Let the consumer be the hero, know your audience, tell their story, not yours.
You know, it's extremely important to understand the local sensitivities and the local tastes. And I think, you know, there's loads of examples of brands who've done this really well. Even if you take a really big brand like McDonald's or like KFC, especially take KFC is a very popular brand in Indonesia. And it's actually been able to become more of a lifestyle brand. So at least pre-pandemic, offering, you know, having a disco kind of like a nightclub feel to it in certain outlets, you know, to really kind of bring people together and make it a different space. And 7-Eleven, when it was in the country, was a similar kind of story where it kind of adapted its reason for being to make it a really worthwhile or a really integral part of the Indonesian landscape, I guess. And I think, again, along with what Ong said, I think if you're looking at foreigners entering into Indonesia, it's also very important to make sure you have good partners and also have very good advice, get as much good advice as you possibly can in terms of, you know, in all sorts of business areas. So.
I'd like to thank the panelists. I'd like to thank all of you and the audience for attending what I think has been a very interesting hour and a half. So thank you very much and goodbye, everyone.